Another week, another policy change. This time, SMSFs were in the firing line. Hi everyone, it's Aidan here with another iStrategic Weekly Insight for Friday, the 3rd of July. The federal government just cut a deal with the Greens to get their CGT and negative gearing changes through Parliament. The bargaining chip was a ban on new limited recourse borrowing arrangements, or LRBAs, for residential property purchased through a self-managed super fund. The announcement generated plenty of headlines, with the Greens claiming it would improve housing affordability by stopping those greedy investors from competing with first home buyers. Well, let's test that theory in a moment. But first, what's actually happened? Importantly, these changes are not retrospective. Existing residential property LRBAs are fully grandfathered and remain unaffected. Secondly, contracts signed before the commencement date will also proceed, while transactions already underway will have a 45-day transition period to complete. So that window's closing fast for those who are currently going through a transaction. And lastly, and importantly, commercial property borrowing through SMSFs is also unchanged. So these changes only affect residential property investing borrowing in an SMSF. All right, the Greens are touting this as a win for renters and a blow to those nasty, wealthy property investors. However, SMSF residential property borrowing accounts for less than 1% of total residential property lending in Australia and represents less than half of 1% of new housing finance each year. Now, against Australia's residential property market, which is now valued at approximately $12.6 trillion, yes, that's a trillion with a T, residential LRBAs account for around $56 billion. So a very, very small percentage. In reality, it represents only a small portion of overall housing activity. Australia's affordability challenges stem primarily from structural supply issues rather than relatively small segment of investor demand. Planning approvals, construction costs, labour shortages, infrastructure investment, population growth, interest rate settings, and the pace of new housing delivery all play significant roles in determining housing supply. And I've talked about those at length. This current change does nothing to address those underlying drivers at all. In reality, many of the people using residential LRBAs are ordinary Australians attempting to build retirement wealth through a regulated investment structure, which is what it was set up for in the first place. For example, those with a super balance of, say, between 300 and 500,000 were able to use some borrowing to obtain a property for around 700 to 900,000. Now, that's ordinary, everyday, hardworking Australians, and that represents the majority of my clients who purchase using an SMSF. It's in that sort of bracket. Ironically, wealthier investors often have a large enough super balance that they don't even need to use borrowings in their super at all, or they can find alternatives. So the policy shift doesn't necessarily affect them anyway. Anyway, some background is limited recourse borrowing arrangements have existed within Australia's superannuation framework since 2007 and operate under strict legislative rules. The limited recourse component is designed to reduce risk by ensuring that in the event of default, lenders can only pursue the specific property held within the bare trust, not the other assets inside the SMSF. Only around 1 in 10 SMSFs currently utilise an LRBA, and those borrowings represent approximately 3% of total SMSF assets. For many investors with moderate superannuation balances, like my clients that I was talking about, borrowing made residential property accessible within their retirement strategy. Without that ability, purchasing residential property outright will become simply unattainable for many SMSF trustees, which is why I don't really support the change. I think it's a miss. All right, key insights. The biggest takeaway isn't necessarily what happens in the housing market. It's because that will be negligible. It's what happens to investment strategy. For Australians planning to purchase residential property inside their SMSF using borrowed funds, the options going forward have just become very limited. Investors may now need to reconsider how property fits within their long-term retirement planning and explore alternative structures or investment approaches to achieve their goals. As always, the right strategy will depend on individual circumstances, objectives, and professional advice. Legislative changes are part of investing. It's, we all exist in the framework, I guess. However, the present government is making some large changes in a very short period of time, leaving most of us a little shell-shocked and trying to pivot quickly. I try not to react emotionally to policy announcements. I just try to understand exactly what has changed, who it affects, and how it influences our strategy. In summary, I think Australia's long-term housing challenges are likely to remain closely tied to supply, population growth, and the pace at which new housing can be delivered. Not, it won't be affected at all by this present change. As always, get the facts, don't react to headlines. If you're considering purchasing property through an SMSF and you're wondering how these changes might affect your investment strategy, please feel free to get in touch. I'm not a financial advisor, and as such, I don't give financial advice, but as a property strategist, I'm always happy to discuss the market and explain the implications of policy changes and help investors make informed decisions. Anyway, that's it for me this week. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was helpful. Have a great week.